Canada's war debts. Our grandparents returned from the battlefields to the farm fields and factories, quickly paid off their war debts, and handed us the best standard of living the world has ever seen. That's right. They ran the biggest surpluses the country has ever seen, only 2 years after the war ended. We are now 2 years since COVID, and the Trudeau government's deficits are only growing. The federal government forecasts an additional $186 billion in deficit spending between now and 2029, and the Trudeau government has said it is on track to balance the budget in the year never.
The commitment needs to be a commitment to grow the economy, and the budget will balance itself.
Now on to our companies. Not only do government debts exceed the size of our entire economy, the same is true for the corporate debt held by our businesses. And that was the case even before COVID struck. Even Canada's financial institutions, like TD Economics, were starting to worry as early as February 2020, before COVID-19. They reported that Canada's businesses had debts that equaled almost 120% of our entire GDP, which ranked the third highest among all G20 countries, only behind China and France. The same report also indicated that debt payments were close to historic highs and, quote, a higher share of corporate income is going to servicing debts, even with what were at the time unusually low interest rates. What happens when interest rates return to their normal, long-term, historical average levels, and these payments increased further? And since that 2020 report, things have not gotten much better. We still have corporate debt that equals 115% of our GDP, which puts us in the top 5 of the G20 countries and near an all-time record for Canada. This as debt is slowly rolling over into recently raised interest rates, which means higher payments for the businesses that employ our people and pay out dividends to our pension funds. That is a problem. In fact, the same families who work for these highly indebted companies and pay taxes to these highly indebted governments are themselves carrying record-smashing debt burdens. Data from the Bank for International Settlements shows that household debt to GDP now stands at 103% of GDP, by far the highest of any G7 country and almost twice the G20 average. Even before COVID, we saw a glimpse of the danger of rising interest rates when the Bank of Canada raised its overnight lending rate between 2017 and 2018 to 1.75%. Still a low level. This tiny increase in rates multiplied by a massive stock of debt required households spend 15% of their incomes on interest and principal payments, one of the highest on record. This caused a very large bump in the number of Canadians claiming insolvency because they could not pay their bills. Remember, this was all before COVID-19. Ironically, COVID emergency measures such as plummeting interest rates, bill payment deferrals, cash supports, and large-scale bans on consumer spending for things like restaurants may have given a temporary reprieve to the households that were beginning to go insolvent just before the pandemic hit. What is most astounding about this spike in insolvencies is how small were the interest rate increases that caused them. After rates began to rise in 2022, the number of insolvencies have increased even more, that is by 12%, between 2021 and 2022. So, think of this. If tiny increases in rates before COVID led to a major bump in insolvencies, imagine what the very large increases that we have seen over the last 8 months will do as people's debts roll over into higher and higher rates. Slowly but surely, massive household debts are renewing at higher rates and causing people to face ever higher monthly payments. Canadians currently devote 15.4% of their incomes to pay their debts, both interest and principal, according to TD Bank. For reference, just before the global financial crisis, Americans were spending 13.2% to service their debts. And that was what led to a massive economic crisis south of the border. In other words, our consumers are spending more on debt than were American consumers right before they blew up the world economy.
The Dow tumbled more than 500 points after two pillars of the street tumbled over the weekend. Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old firm, filed for bankruptcy.
Worse, the burden of household debt is heavily concentrated among the poorest people. For example, in the spring of 2023, those aged 45 to 54 in the lowest income quintile, the bottom 20% of income earners, had debts equal to 732% of their disposable income, an increase of well over 300 percentage points since 2014. Even if some of these spikes are temporary, and where have we heard that before, the overall trend is ever greater household debt concentrated in the hands of the people who can least afford to pay it. How long before these people miss their payments, lose their homes, and go bankrupt? These older and poorer working families often have the most debt, the biggest wage losses, the worst career prospects, and the least amount of time to make up losses.
The high cost of rents, I just couldn't afford an apartment. I couldn't afford anywhere to live. So I ended up buying a van, and I now live in a van.
And you have a full-time job?
Yeah, I work full-time at the hospital as a CCA.
Rising debt for families also slows the economy. Evan Siddell, the president and chief executive officer of the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, said, quote, "Canadians are among the world leaders in household debt. Pre-COVID, the ratio of gross debt to GDP for Canada was at 99%. These ratios are well in excess of the 80% threshold, above which the Bank for International Settlements has shown that national debt intensifies the drag on GDP growth. We can all expect that insolvencies and bankruptcies will rise dramatically in 2024 as families just cannot pay the interest on their back-breaking debt, while that same debt weighs down the growth in incomes with which debt payments are made. A double whammy for families, businesses, and governments." To summarize,
You'll forgive me if I don't think about monetary policy.
Canada's debt to GDP ratio has smashed records over the last several years, is 50% higher than its long-term average, and much higher than was the case in many countries just before they went into a debt crisis. All of this proves beyond the doubt that Canada checks the box in the Reinhardt-Rogoff test of sustained debt buildups, especially for households. This might sound like a lot of gloom and doom, with no hope or way out. But think of the generation that came back from war in 1945. The generation had survived the Great Depression, had gone in their early 20s to fight and defeat Hitler, Mussolini, and Imperial Japan. They came home exhausted, wounded, and heartbroken from the loss of their fellow soldiers on the battlefields of the world. And they were deeply indebted, having paid for that war. And what did they do? Did they take a decade off while they borrowed money and lived off their grandchildren? No, they had protected their grandchildren's freedom, and now it was time to protect their finances. They immediately got to work. They cut wasteful spending. They paid off all their debts. They tripled the size of our economy, and they handed over the greatest prosperity the world has ever seen, all before they were old enough to retire. If they could do that then, imagine what we can do now, with a common-sense government that lives within its means, leaves more in your pocket, and lets you get ahead, where hard work is rewarded, where we make more and borrow less. That is common sense.